August 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The war had ended, but the air still trembled with silence. A humid haze hung over the American processing camp as hundreds of captured Japanese soldiers shuffled forward, stripped of weapons, ranks, and illusions. Among them were women in faded khaki uniforms, the insignia of the Imperial Japanese Army Nurse Corps barely visible through sweat and dust. One of them, Lieutenant Aiko Takahashi, no longer held her posture of military precision. Her boots had split open. Her once white gloves were gray with ash. When the American sentry waved her toward the tents, she hesitated, expecting interrogation, perhaps humiliation. Instead, a young U.S. Army nurse stepped forward, holding out a clean white towel and a small bar of soap. Aiko stared at it as if it were a trick. For years, she'd been told that surrender meant degradation, that Allied troops would treat them worse than animals. Yet here, in the sweltering light of defeat, the enemy offered her something she hadn't seen in months, the means to wash away the war's filth. That bar of soap became more than a gesture. It became the moment when propaganda met truth, and lost. In the years leading up to 1945, Imperial Japan had transformed into a nation entirely mobilized for war. Every street, every school, and every home pulsed with the same rhythm. Serve the emperor, die before surrender. For Japanese women, that call took many forms. Some sewed uniforms, others worked in munitions plants. But a growing number joined the Women's Volunteer Corps and the Imperial Army Nurse Corps, serving closer and closer to the front lines as the war turned desperate. By 1944, Japan's empire was collapsing. American forces had breached the Pacific Ring. Air raids turned cities into furnaces. In the rubble, Tokyo announced new volunteer recruitment drives, calling women to take up military roles, not as combatants, but as administrators, medical personnel, and communication clerks in occupied territories from Burma to the Philippines. Many of these women, including officers like Lieutenant Takahashi, were educated, disciplined, and utterly convinced that they served a divine cause. They memorized the Senjin-kun, the field service code, which demanded absolute loyalty and forbade surrender under any circumstance. It taught that capture was dishonor worse than death. Propaganda amplified this creed. Posters and radio broadcasts warned of Allied savagery, tales of mutilation, torture, and desecration. All false, but believed. School children were shown illustrations of Western soldiers laughing over Japanese corpses. The result was total psychological conditioning. When these women packed their uniforms, they expected to either serve until victory or die in the flames of defeat. Then came 1945. The firebombing of Tokyo in March turned the capital into an inferno, killing over 100,000 in one night. Cities like Osaka and Nagoya followed. Food vanished. Families sold heirlooms for rice husks. Women's divisions were reorganized again, now tasked with defensive preparations, nursing, and sometimes even training with bamboo spears in case of invasion. In the Philippines, where Japanese forces fought their final desperate battles, women officers were ordered to assist field hospitals and signal units. When Manila fell in early 1945, many were trapped behind retreating lines. They saw their comrades die from wounds, hunger, and disease. Some watched Japanese commanders commit ritual suicide rather than surrender. By August, when Emperor Hirohito's voice broke the nation's silence with the words, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage," those who still lived were ghosts of an empire that no longer existed. The women who would later stand in Allied custody were not just prisoners, they were remnants of a vanished belief system. Their world, one where purity, obedience, and self-sacrifice defined virtue, had collapsed overnight. And yet they still expected punishment. They had been told for years that Americans viewed them as subhuman enemies, not as women, not as nurses, not as human beings. So when they were gathered in makeshift camps under the tropical sun, weak, filthy, and defeated, they prepared themselves for the worst. But what awaited them was not cruelty. It was something far more disarming: kindness. The surrender of Japan in August 1945 unleashed a wave of confusion that rippled across the Pacific. From Burma to Micronesia, scattered Japanese garrisons received the news days, sometimes weeks, after it was announced. Officers who had once sworn to die for the emperor now faced the unthinkable, laying down their arms before the enemy. In the Philippines, on the island of Luzon, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had already crushed Japan's last major resistance. Jungle trails and mountain hideouts filled with emaciated soldiers and civilians trying to avoid capture. Among them were female officers, army nurses, and communications staff, most of whom had not seen proper food, water, or medical supplies in months. When the U.S. Sixth Army began rounding up survivors for processing, the sight stunned many Allied troops. They had expected soldiers. Instead, they found women in tattered uniforms, hollow-eyed and trembling. Some carried wounded comrades on makeshift stretchers made from bamboo and cloth. Others clutched small notebooks or family photographs, the last fragments of their identities. These women were taken to temporary holding areas that were, by the standards of the time, remarkably humane. American policy toward Japanese prisoners had shifted dramatically since the early, brutal campaigns of 1942. By 1945, Allied command had issued clear directives: treat Japanese captives according to the Geneva Convention, even if Japan had never ratified it. The goal was strategic as much as moral: to show the world and the Japanese people the difference between totalitarian cruelty and democratic mercy. At first, the women could not comprehend it. They had braced for punishment, even execution. Instead, they were given food rations, canned fruit, bread, sometimes even chocolate, and told to bathe. Soap and towels were issued as part of medical intake. To the Americans, it was routine hygiene. To the Japanese women, it was unthinkable generosity. Eyewitness accounts describe the confusion vividly. Allied medics noted how prisoners bowed repeatedly, crying or refusing to touch the offered items until ordered. Some attempted to return the soap, thinking it must be a trick or payment for labor. Many refused to undress before bathing, out of deep cultural shame and fear of exposure to foreign men. It took patient guidance, often from American and Filipino nurses, to convince them they were safe. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, occupation forces under MacArthur's Supreme Command, SKP, began a nationwide effort to demobilize and repatriate millions of Japanese personnel, including more than 350,000 women who had served in auxiliary roles. They returned to a homeland unrecognizable, cities flattened, families missing, and an emperor who had spoken not as a god, but as a man. Yet in those first camps abroad, in the Philippines, Guam, Okinawa, and Borneo, something fundamental began to shift. The women who had believed the Allies were monsters now witnessed discipline, organization, and even compassion. Nurses treated Japanese wounds with the same care as Allied injuries. Officers enforced strict rules against abuse or humiliation. The very system they'd been taught to despise was showing them dignity they had never imagined receiving. That simple gesture, a towel, a bar of soap, a meal shared in silence, became their first encounter with a new moral order. It was not victory or defeat. It was revelation. For the first time in years, these women saw the enemy not as a face of evil, but as human. And that realization would mark the beginning of a transformation, not just within those camps, but across a nation about to rebuild itself from ashes. In the first days of captivity, the women's faces told a story no document could. Many were barely 20. Their hands shook as they accepted food. Their eyes darted nervously at every American movement. Some whispered prayers to ancestors. Others recited fragments of the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, as if clinging to words might protect them from the shame of survival. All their lives they had been taught that surrender meant dishonor. Yet here they were, still alive, and treated as if they mattered. When U.S. Army nurse Helen Ramsey later wrote about those days in her field diary, she noted that they cried over a towel, She and other nurses were under strict instruction. Treat every prisoner as a patient. Cleanliness was not symbolic. It was medical necessity. Lice, infection, and disease spread fast in tropical heat. But as the prisoners washed, some for the first time in weeks, their posture changed. Shoulders lifted. Eyes met again. For a moment, fear gave way to bewildered relief. The women began to speak in broken English, expressing gratitude, or simply bowing repeatedly. American and Filipino personnel were startled by how deeply ingrained their fear had been. What to the Allies was routine camp hygiene, a daily act, became, to these prisoners, the first touch of mercy from an enemy they had demonized for years. That was the quiet human miracle of the Pacific's aftermath. The meeting of two moral worlds that propaganda had kept apart. The policy and tactical angle of the humane treatment of Japanese prisoners was no coincidence. It was a deliberate decision rooted in lessons learned from the brutality of the early Pacific campaigns. In 1942, after the Bataan Death March, American troops had seen what happened when surrendering soldiers were dehumanized. Thousands of POWs perished under Japanese custody. Beaten, starved, and forced to march over 60 miles through tropical heat. Those images hardened U.S. resolve. But by 1944–45, as the Allies advanced, the High Command recognized another strategic truth. Mercy could be weaponized more effectively than vengeance. General Douglas. MacArthur's staff issued orders emphasizing adherence to the Geneva Convention standards, even for those who had never respected them. It was partly moral conviction, partly propaganda strategy. Every well-treated Japanese prisoner was living proof of Allied decency, a counter-narrative. To the image of Western barbarity, Tokyo had spent years. Constructing camps were inspected regularly by Red Cross representatives and war correspondents. Discipline was strict. Any Allied soldier mistreating a prisoner faced court-martial. Medical teams ensured hygiene, nutrition, and controlled access to communication for later repatriation. What emerged was an unintentional yet profound experiment in psychological warfare. The kindness shown to Japanese POWs, especially women, challenged everything they had been taught about their enemy. It forced them to question the moral legitimacy of their own government's propaganda. Many Allied commanders understood the effect intuitively. Cleanliness, medical care, order. These were not luxuries. They were signals of civilization, control, and humanity. For an empire that had justified its conquests under the slogan, "Asia for Asians," seeing its captives treated better by Western forces undermined decades of ideological scaffolding. Each towel issued, each ration shared, was a quiet but deliberate act of re-education. The psychological angle behind the stunned expressions of those Japanese women officers lay a deeper collapse. Not of an army, but of identity. For years, they had been part of a closed moral universe in which purity and obedience defined worth. To bathe under the eyes of an occupying force was not simply to cleanse the body, it was to confront shame itself. Many of them had been taught that foreign men were defilers, that Allied soldiers would mock or violate them. When that did not happen, when instead they were treated with respect, it created a kind of spiritual dissonance. Historians studying post-war Japanese psychology note this moment as a turning point. The women's first reaction was suspicion, believing kindness to be manipulation. But over days and weeks, as patterns repeated, regular meals, medical attention, even opportunities to write letters, disbelief gave way to reflection. For some, the experience would become the first time they questioned the imperial system itself. If the enemy they had been told was barbaric could act humanely, what did that say about the war they had fought? This realization was not spoken aloud. It appeared instead in subtle gestures, a relaxed salute, an unguarded conversation, a quiet tear while washing in clean water. The collapse of ideology often begins not with argument, but with compassion too undeniable to ignore. And so amid tense, humidity, and exhaustion, the transformation began. Enemies becoming witnesses to each other's humanity. The cultural angle to understand the depth of those women's disbelief. one must grasp the Japanese cultural code that shaped them. The imperial era had elevated the concepts of purity, duty, and self-sacrifice into near-religious absolutes. From childhood, girls were taught that their worth lay in endurance and modesty. Cleanliness, both physical and spiritual, was central to that identity. But under wartime conditions, even this sacred idea was corrupted. By 1945, women in service roles lived in filth and deprivation. Hospitals ran out of disinfectant. Water was rationed for drinking, not washing. The very symbol of Japanese womanhood, purity, had been swallowed by mud, blood, and exhaustion. So when Allied nurses handed them soap and towels, the act cut deeper than hygiene. It was as if the enemy had returned something the war had stolen: their dignity. In Japanese culture, cleanliness had always carried moral weight. To wash was to renew one's spirit. To be given the means to do so by a former enemy blurred boundaries that propaganda had enforced for years. This was not domination. It was restoration. The irony was painful. The very people they had been told were uncivilized now represented the reawakening of civilization itself. It was a moment of quiet cultural inversion, the defeated learning humanity from the victors. And for many of those women, that paradox would stay with them long after they returned home. The moral angle war strips morality to its bones. Yet in the ruins of the Pacific, something unexpected emerged: compassion as a form of power. American and Filipino personnel who managed these camps rarely saw themselves as moral reformers. They were following procedure: feed, clean, document, repatriate. But on a deeper level, their behavior became a living refutation of the ideology that had driven the Japanese Empire. To the Allied command, the treatment of POWs was more than legal compliance. It was moral theater. Every humane gesture sent a message that civilization did not depend on conquest, but on conscience. Reports from the Philippine Liberation Army working alongside U.S. units reveal that even local civilians, many of whom had suffered under Japanese occupation, joined in supplying food and medical help to captured women. For these civilians, it was not forgiveness but justice on higher terms, the moral high ground of decency. In later interviews, several former Japanese nurses described the moment they began to question what honor really meant. One recounted watching an American medic bandage the leg of a wounded Japanese soldier who, days earlier, had sworn to kill him. "I realized," she said years later, "that we had not understood strength at all." That was the war's quiet moral revolution, the rediscovery of humanity in the very place it had been denied. The leadership institutional angle. At the higher command levels, these encounters were recorded, studied, and even leveraged in post-war planning. U.S. intelligence officers debriefed thousands of prisoners, men and women alike, seeking insight into Japanese morale and ideology. The consistent theme among women's testimonies was shock at humane treatment. American policymakers realized they were witnessing the psychological dismantling of a militarist society. The next step would be to guide that vacuum toward reconstruction rather than resentment. When General MacArthur assumed authority as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, in Tokyo, he and his team understood the symbolic weight of mercy. The occupation would not simply punish Japan, it would re-educate it. Women's experiences, especially those of nurses and clerks, became vital to that vision. In 1946, SCAP launched sweeping reforms granting Japanese women suffrage, property rights, and access to education, transformations unthinkable under the old regime. Many of the same women who had once served in uniform became translators, clerks, or nurses for Allied headquarters. A few had begun that journey the day they were handed a towel in a POW camp. The message from the top was clear: Japan's rebirth must begin with respect for the individual. That respect had already been demonstrated in the smallest ways, through soap, clean water, and the quiet recognition that even the defeated deserved dignity. What had begun as an administrative necessity became a moral cornerstone of occupation policy. The treatment of prisoners was not just about ending a war. It was about teaching what peace looked like. By the time these women were repatriated to Japan, the image of the enemy had changed forever, and as they stepped back onto their homeland, they carried with them the memory of that dissonant kindness. A living seed of the transformation their nation was about to undergo. The next phase of the story would reveal how this small human moment echoed across entire military systems, and how the confrontation between belief and reality reached its most dramatic point within the camps themselves. August 24th, 1945. Luzon, northern Philippines. Rain had just begun to fall, thin and warm, washing through the dust of a war that had burned itself out. Inside a makeshift American field camp outside San Fernando, rows of canvas tents sagged under humidity. The Japanese prisoners, several hundred in number, were divided by rank and role. Among them, a smaller tent bore a wooden sign: Female Personnel, Imperial Japanese Army. Lieutenant Aiko Takahashi, once a medical officer attached to the 14th Area Army, stood among 30 others. The women were silent, hands clasped, uniforms clinging damply to their skin. None dared look directly at the American sentries. A U.S. sergeant approached with a clipboard. His voice was flat, procedural: names, ranks, health conditions. Then came orders, translated through a Filipino interpreter. Each prisoner would bathe, receive medical inspection, and be issued clean clothing before mealtime. Aiko froze. Bathing was expected, but the meaning of inspection filled her with dread. Her mind flashed through years of indoctrination. Warnings that surrender to the enemy would mean violation, dishonor, and worse. She bowed low, trembling, waiting for humiliation to begin. Instead, a nurse entered the tent. She was American, her khaki uniform pressed, her hair pinned back beneath a white cap. She smiled gently and spoke through the interpreter. "You are safe here. Please wash. These are yours." She placed a folded towel and a bar of soap on a wooden stool beside each woman. At first, no one moved. The silence was almost unbearable. The rain outside intensified, hammering on the canvas like distant artillery. Then one woman, a younger corporal, stepped forward. She touched the towel as if it might burn her. When nothing happened, she broke down, sobbing soundlessly. Others followed, hesitating, whispering prayers, touching the soap to their faces as if unsure it was real. They washed in silence, the water pooling at their feet, carrying away grime, lice, and months of fear. For the first time in years, their skin was clean. From outside, American guards looked on quietly. They had expected hardened soldiers, but what they saw were exhausted girls, too broken even to speak. One later wrote in his field journal, "They looked like they were washing away their whole war." That moment, fragile, almost invisible, became the emotional turning point of an empire. Because as the soap foamed and the fear receded, something larger shifted: the collapse of a belief system. The women began to see the enemy as human, even kind. And the Americans, seeing their tears and gratitude, began to comprehend the scale of Japan's indoctrination. The war that had seemed defined by savagery now revealed an opposite truth: that compassion could break through where force had failed. Medical officers soon recorded noticeable changes. Within a week, the women's nutrition improved, their sleep steadied, and their speech loosened. They began asking for books, paper, and sometimes hymn sheets from nearby chaplains. A few even volunteered to assist in hospital wards treating wounded Japanese men. It was not reconciliation yet, but it was the first fragile bridge toward it. Reports from the U.S. 323rd Medical Battalion describe similar scenes in Okinawa and Guam. Women prisoners insisting on bowing deeply before Allied nurses, or crying as they were handed small parcels of toiletries. In each instance, the response was the same: disbelief turning into trust. No treaty or negotiation had accomplished it. Only soap, water, and dignity had. And yet, beneath this gentleness, something else was beginning to stir. A deeper realization on both sides that the war had not merely destroyed nations, but had reshaped what it meant to be civilized. The Americans saw it as victory through morality. The Japanese women experienced it as rebirth through humility. But that transformation was not complete. The next phase would take place inside the records, the testimonies, and the faces of those who lived the moment, the part where memory and history finally converged. Okinawa, late August 1945. A typhoon loomed over the island as Allied engineers worked to rebuild airstrips and medical stations. In a fenced compound near the village of Katsuyama, another group of Japanese women officers had just arrived. Survivors of the island's final catastrophic battle. They came barefoot, carrying nothing. Among them were nurses who had treated the wounded inside limestone caves, using torn bandages and rainwater collected in helmets. When American personnel found them, they were near starvation. One medic later wrote, "They were so weak they bowed while sitting down." That evening, as the wind howled through the camp, the women were ordered to receive medical attention. The tent flaps lifted, and once again, soap, towels, and clean water awaited them. Some burst into tears, others fell to their knees, pressing the towels to their faces. An officer named Yoshiko Nakatani, who had survived the Shuri Line bombardments, refused at first. She told her interpreter she could not accept gifts from those she had fought. But the interpreter, a Japanese-American nurse named Keiko Tanaka, replied softly, "This is not a gift. This is health." That word, kenko, health, broke something inside Nakatani. She bathed silently, then whispered to Tanaka that she had not felt clean since 1943. Later, in her post-war interview, she would say, "That towel was the first thing that told me I was still a person." Such moments multiplied across the Pacific. In Borneo, Guam, and Saipan, Allied medics recorded identical reactions from Japanese female prisoners: disbelief, tears, and gradual calm. These were not isolated gestures. They were the visible unraveling of years of militarist indoctrination. To the Americans, it was proof that moral conduct could be a weapon stronger than bombs. To the Japanese, it was a confrontation with their own humanity, one they had long suppressed under the demand for sacrifice. As the days passed, the camps began to change. Women who once refused to speak began offering help, cleaning wards, distributing rations, writing names for registration lists. Allied officers noticed the discipline with which they performed these tasks. The same meticulous order once used in service to the Empire was now serving recovery. Meanwhile, correspondence flowed back to headquarters in Manila and Tokyo. Commanders noted that the humane treatment of Japanese prisoners was accelerating the psychological surrender of an entire nation. Civilians in Japan, hearing rumors that their captured relatives were alive and well, began cooperating more willingly with occupation authorities. Compassion had become strategic, the quiet diplomacy of behavior. Even within the Allied ranks, the moment was transformative. Soldiers who had seen comrades die in brutal island battles now found themselves caring for the very people they had fought. For many, it stirred conflict. Some refused to engage. Others found unexpected peace in it. "I hated them," one Marine later confessed, "until I saw them cry over a piece of soap." The line between victor and vanquished began to blur. When word of these scenes reached MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo, staff psychologists noted the potential for cultural influence. Reports suggested that such humane interactions might expedite reorientation, meaning they softened resistance to occupation reforms. Behind that clinical language was a profound truth. Every towel handed to a Japanese prisoner was a small rehearsal for the moral reconstruction of Japan. Weeks later, as repatriation ships began carrying these women back home, Allied officers noticed something remarkable. The women left the camps in silence, but many bowed deeply toward the Americans, not as soldiers, but as human beings. In her final field note from Luzon, Nurse Helen Ramsey wrote, "They came to us as ghosts of war. They left as women again." That was the turning point, not the moment of surrender, not the treaties signed aboard the USS Missouri, but this, the private, unrecorded moment when individuals saw through the smoke of hatred and recognized the shared fragility of life. It was a victory no army could measure, no document could capture. A moral conquest achieved not with force, but with the smallest gesture of decency. And from that turning point would emerge the long, uncertain road toward reconstruction, a journey that would reshape both Japan's soul and the world's understanding of mercy in war. Tokyo Bay, September 2, 1945. On the deck of the USS Missouri, the Empire of Japan signed its formal surrender. Cameras clicked, pens scratched across parchment. But far from the ceremony, in 1,000 silent corners of the Pacific, another kind of surrender was taking place. One not of governments, but of hearts. In camps across the Philippines, Okinawa, and Guam, the Japanese women prisoners who had once trembled before their captors now lived under a different rhythm. The rhythm of order, hygiene, and quiet civility. Their uniforms had been replaced by simple khaki dresses. They rose at dawn, cleaned their quarters, and helped American nurses care for the wounded. Each morning began with the same ritual: a basin of clean water, a bar of soap, and a folded towel, small symbols that life could be rebuilt from the ashes. To many of them, these gestures meant more than liberation. They meant purification, not only of body, but of conscience. Lieutenant Aiko Takahashi, the same nurse who had first frozen before the offered towel, later wrote in her testimony to the Tokyo War Crimes Commission, "We expected vengeance, but found something far stranger. They treated us like we had never stopped being human. I began to believe that maybe we could start again." Her words echoed the broader shift happening across occupied Japan. For the first time in decades, compassion was being reintroduced into a society that had long glorified endurance and sacrifice. The Americans, too, were learning. In official reports, military psychologists noted how acts of kindness from guards toward Japanese prisoners have shown remarkable efficiency in securing cooperation and discipline. What began as policy evolved into something personal, a reconciliation, born in daily contact, in shared fatigue, in the quiet routines of survival. By early 1946, thousands of female POWs had been processed and repatriated through ports in Yokohama and Nagasaki. Many carried Red Cross parcels, stamped with English words they could not read. Care, relief, hope. Yet they understood the meaning instinctively. Some wept as the ships drew close to Japan's ruined shores. Others remained silent, staring at the blackened skyline where their homes had once stood. In their hearts, the enemy they had feared had transformed into something disorienting, a people capable of both immense destruction and impossible mercy. Japanese newspapers, under Allied supervision, began printing accounts of POW treatment, carefully selected, but real. These stories, circulated quietly in post-war classrooms and universities, contributed to the slow reshaping of national memory. The war had ended not only in defeat, but in exposure. The revelation that much of what the Japanese public had been told about their enemies was a lie. Meanwhile, in the United States, these same encounters appeared in letters home. A nurse from Ohio wrote, "They were just girls, like us, same age, same fear, just wearing the wrong uniform." That sentence, printed later in Life magazine, softened thousands of hearts still hardened by wartime loss. In that fragile aftermath, both nations began to see each other not through the lens of ideology, but through the human cost of obedience. The simple act of washing, of cleansing wounds, uniforms, hands, became symbolic. It was the ritual through which two former enemies tried to cleanse their souls of war. Years later, when Japan rebuilt its medical corps under the new constitution, some of those same nurses who had been POWs helped train new recruits, this time under democratic values of service, compassion, and humanity. They never forgot the moment it began, not with surrender, not with speeches, but with a bar of soap offered under the Philippine sun, when an American nurse reached out, and an enemy dared to accept. The war that began in fire ended in water. Cities burned, armies collapsed, empires dissolved, And yet, in the end, what endured were not the machines of war, but the gestures of compassion that followed them. The image of a Japanese woman officer, standing barefoot in a bamboo tent, holding a bar of soap she never expected to receive, captures more than a single moment of mercy. It captures the turning of an age. Before 1945, Japan's ideology had glorified purity through sacrifice, through dying for the emperor. After 1945, purity took on another meaning: to cleanse, to rebuild, to live. That change began not in Tokyo's government halls, but in forgotten camps under tropical rain, in the silence between former enemies learning to look at each other again. Every towel handed out, every wound cleaned, every bowl of rice shared across barbed wire chipped away at the walls built by propaganda and fear. And though it did not erase the horrors of the war, the massacres, the starvation, the bombings, it proved something enduring: that mercy can outlast ideology. In post-war Japan, many of those same women went on to become teachers, nurses, and midwives. Their children would grow up in a nation transformed, a society that replaced militarism with service, conquest with care. And in quiet corners of hospitals and homes, when they spoke of the war, they rarely mentioned battles. They spoke instead of that first towel, that first moment of human kindness when they realized they were still worthy of being clean. Historians often search for grand explanations, treaties, doctrines, strategies, but sometimes history turns on smaller hinges. A pen stroke may end a war. A gesture may begin a peace. The story of Japan's women officers, humiliated by defeat, yet redeemed by dignity, reminds us that civilization is not measured by victory, but by restraint. The Americans who handed them soap may not have known it, but they were doing more than following procedure. They were demonstrating that even after total war, decency could still survive. 80 years later, the lesson remains quietly powerful: that humanity, when stripped of its symbols and uniforms, still recognizes itself, even across languages, across hatred, across the ruins of history. And so, the bar of soap and the folded towel, mundane, almost trivial, became artifacts of moral recovery. They marked the precise point where Japan's surrender stopped being an ending and became a beginning.